Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to all those who are Zooming in. So to our various audiences, thank you so much. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Canadian Studies Committee at Yale and our advisory committee that includes our very proud Canadian Dean of Yale College, Pericles Lewis. I am Jay Gitlin, the coordinator of that committee, and none of this would be possible. Several of us, Brendan will also thank, without the support of the Macmillan Center. With their help, and I should probably hold a copy up, but I didn't bring a copy over. Sarah, can you just get me a copy of the journal? I'm going to just show it off for the screen here. So we're very proud. Here we go. Thank you. Need to do that. So we're very proud because we were aiming to have more visibility on campus, and I think that's being achieved. And so this year, with the help of the Macmillan Center, we published our very first issue, Volume 1, Issue 1 of the Yale Journal of Canadian Studies. We are now working on Volume 2 with Brendan in charge, and so there will be another volume coming out hopefully later this year. So we're trying to increase our presence on campus. And there we have actually a member of our Yale Canadian Committee, Ryan Brasso over there. And so we're very pleased that the visibility is increasing and our activities are increasing. And just to give you a little background of this, Yale has actually maintained close ties with Canada for nearly 3 centuries, having established a tradition of scholarly and academic excellence in a range of Canadian topics very early on. The university has actually played a significant role in the development of Canadian studies in the US. I also want to thank Hannah Quinn and Kobe Chung, president of the Canadian students at Yale. They call it sometimes the Canadian Club. And so we have many Canadian students. It's the largest group of students from outside the United States are Canadian students. Yale first accepted Canadian students in the early 18th century and has now graduated the second highest number of Canadians among all American institutions. Now, on to the symposium, why we're here. So I want to introduce our moderator. Brendan Shanahan is an associate research scholar here at Yale's Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies and a lecturer in the history department. Brendan did his undergraduate studies at McGill, received his PhD in history from UC Berkeley in 2018. He is an immigration historian by training, and he also teaches comparative US and Canadian history. So we have a number of courses every year in Canadian history. Brendan originally came to Yale as a postdoc at the Center for the Study of Representative Institutions in 2019 and has been active in Canadian studies ever since. His works have or will soon appear in Law and History Review, the Catholic Historical Review, and the American Review of Canadian Studies, among other venues. So Brendan's been very busy, and with that, I turn the program over to Brendan.
Thank you so much, Jay. And thank you all for coming here today to the symposium, either in person or virtually. We have a very big crowd online for our very exciting event, Smoke from Canada, Climate Change, Forest Fires, and the Future. As Jay said, my name is Brendan Shanahan, and I'm here at Yale's Canadian Studies, and I'm a lecturer in the history department. And it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to serve as moderator of today's event. And before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to offer a few moments to offer some very well-earned, deserved, and heartfelt thanks. First to Jay, thank you so much for leading us as always. To Sarah Hopkins and to Mark Rowland here at Macmillan and at Yale's Canadian Studies, who've moved mountains behind the scenes to make this possible. Thank you both. And to the Macmillan Center more broadly for its support. We extend our great appreciation. So today's symposium is going to be divided into a few parts. First, 3 interdisciplinary expert panelists here at Yale, Dr. Jennifer Marlin, Dr. Sebastian Bloch-Munguia, and Professor Kai Chen will each discuss their ongoing research related to climate change, wildfires, and or its effects on public health within and beyond Canada's borders. Then Professor Pierre Min of the Université de Montréal returns to Yale to deliver a keynote, Blurry Horizons, Voluntary Childlessness, and the Fate of Uncertainty in Quebec. I will then moderate a discussion among the panelists with the time we have remaining, largely driven by the Q&A with you, the audience here and online. So if you do have a question, we look forward to hearing from you then. And if you're online and you want to add a question, please do so in the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can. It is exceedingly difficult to try to introduce our four presenters, given their extensive CVs and well-deserved accolades, but I'll do my best to do so briefly. First up will be Jennifer Marlin, PhD, a senior research scientist and lecturer in the School of the Environment and director of data science at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. She is also a lecturer in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology at Yale. She obtained her PhD and MS in geography from the University of Oregon. Dr. Marlin studies climate change, extreme weather, particularly wildfires, and science communication. She has authored over 70 peer-reviewed publications and produced a variety of interactive data visualizations supporting climate change communication, such as the Six Americas Super Short Survey, YAY, acronym YASI, exclamation mark, and the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. I just had the opportunity to learn more about her team's work in the Yale Climate Change Opinion Maps in an article that just appeared recently in the Scientific American, which I encourage all of you to check out on your own time if you want to learn more. Next up, we'll have Dr. Sébastien Bloch-Mugia, research affiliate at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. He received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University in 2022. And now he's at Yale's Center for Environmental Law and Policy. There, he's project director on the 2024 Environmental Performance Index, or EPI, a massive collaborative project which aids policymakers and investors concerned about climate change in shaping environmental policies and investments around the globe. It zooms out to examine countries' overall environmental performance and zooms in to disaggregate their respective strengths and areas of improvement. EPI has truly become a major tool in efforts to meet the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and we look forward to hearing more as well. Third, will be Professor Kai Chen, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology, Environmental Health at the Yale School of Public Health. He also serves as Director of Research, Climate Change and Health, Deputy Faculty Director, Climate Change and Health, and is an affiliated faculty member at the Yale Institute for Global Health. After receiving his PhD in Environmental Science and Engineering in 2016 from Nanjing University and serving as an Alexander von Humboldt postdoc in Germany, Professor Chen came to Yale in 2019, where his work focuses on climate change, air pollution, and public health. Among his numerous publications, Professor Chen recently served as lead author for Canadian Wildfire Smoke and Asthma Syndrome Emergency Department Visits in New York City, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association this past fall. Very, very important and very apt publication for our discussion today. And finally, and most certainly not least, Professor Pierre Min, Associate Professor at the Université de Montréal's Anthropology Department and School of Public Health, has graciously and generously returned here to Yale. Professor Min received his undergraduate education at Yale, completed his graduate studies at McGill University, and served as a postdoc at the University of California and a joint Berkeley-San Francisco program. A capacious teacher and scholar, Professor Min's areas of expertise range from ethnocultural research on local and international medicine in Haiti to the development of global health education. He's offered numerous works, including recently, Where They Need Me, Local Clinicians and the Workings of Global Health in Haiti, published in 2022 by Cornell University Press. He presents his keynote today on some of his ongoing research about the rise of voluntary childlessness in modern Quebec and francophone Canada more broadly. So without further ado, I cede the floor to Professor Marlin.
Thank you so much. Is this on and working? It's good. Okay. Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you, Jay, Sarah, everyone. It's an honor to be here to talk about this very important topic. And I am going to share some research, not just from myself, but I would like to provide a little bit of background for the talk today by talking about what people think about smoke and wildfires from Canada and how these kinds of events are perceived in the context of climate change. So I'm going to be drawing on survey data produced by my colleagues, myself and my colleagues at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. This image is quite striking. It's of smoke over the wildfires centered on Alberta. It's a satellite image, and I think up there it says the image is about 69 kilometers wide. And this event was obviously really striking to all of us, but it was especially close to my heart because I've been studying wildfires for several decades now, although recently I've turned to studying how people perceive these kinds of events and whether they link them to climate change. So just to kind of set the stage and give a little data-based evidence for how unusual these fires were, they started in May, they burned in the east, and they burned in the west, then they burned again in the east, really from ocean to ocean. It was extraordinary in terms of how much forest these fires were burning. So you can see this is a graph of the smoke of PM 2.5 particles that are very harmful to our health, which we'll hear more about. And it just shows you how unusual it was even compared to the big fire seasons of 2020, 2021, and 2022. The fires overall burned about 45 million acres, which is an 18.5 million hectares. So that's about 2 times the size of Portugal. The smoke came down to the United States. It made New York City the most polluted city in the world. Can I turn this off? I don't know if I could turn that off. For a couple of days anyway, so affecting millions of people beyond Canada. And so I was really curious to know, is the public drawing connections? Did the public draw connections between these events and climate change? Because these fires were exacerbated by climate change. Climate change set the stage for these fires by changing the average global temperature. It heats up the land surface. It causes soils to dry out faster. The fire season is much longer than it was. It's several months longer than it was just a few decades ago. So the carbon emissions produced by those fires were extraordinary compared to historical baselines. And this is a very clear fingerprint, if you will, of climate change on ecosystems and on wildfires. So Canada contributed about 25% of global carbon emissions from these fires, terrestrial carbon emissions. And I think that says doubled its previous, I can't read behind this thing, but it doubled its previous emissions. I can move it. Let's see. Oh yeah, I can see my notes here. Nope, I'm not coordinated enough. That's okay. It's not important. So we study at the YPCCC, we study climate change opinions and how the public perceives, not wildfires. We do ask a little bit about wildfires, but this is just a chart showing how opinions about climate change have changed over the past 15 or 16 years. And you can see that they're actually quite stable. And currently about 72% of Americans think that global warming is happening. 15% of Americans think that the planet is not warming. And the gap between there are people who don't know. So if you think about what might be affecting these kinds of wiggles, these trends, there was a very large Texas drought, a very severe Texas drought in 2011 and 2012. That was associated with also a heat wave and wildfires. And that happened, that was over a decade ago. Then we had a release of the IPCC report in 2013, which for the first time said human causes were extremely likely in exacerbating and contributing to climate change. There was no real impact from those, as far as we can tell, on belief that climate change is a real problem anyway. We had 3 massive hurricanes in 2017. I just pulled out a few examples of like large scientific report releases and extreme weather events, right, that might have impacted public opinion. But there really isn't a pattern here. That's the point. The horrible campfire in California that devastated, like pretty much wiped out the town of Paradise in Northern California, right? Like made national, international news. No real impacts from that. Another release of the IPCC report that said now human influence on climate change is unequivocal. There are some variations and fluctuations here. And then the Canadian wildfires in 2023, no response in the overall number. And there have been many studies conducted that try to match these extreme events to changes in public opinion. And basically, it's incredibly difficult to detect a correlation or any statistically significant effect, at least at the national level. You can look at who was in office. If anything, that might have more of an effect. When Obama was elected in 2008 and took office in 2009, there was a dramatic drop in public opinion. And that's really, there was also a financial collapse at that time. But it was really the birth of the Tea Party and political polarization in the US that caused that decline. And we've been kind of recovering since then. So very quickly, I want to just share some maps because we actually did model how the public in Canada, how Canadians think about climate change and global warming, and 83%, these maps are a bit old, I should say. So this is data from 2018. So it's probably about 5 points higher now. But nonetheless, widespread agreement that the Earth is warming across Canada. In Canada, fewer think the planet's getting warmer because of human activities, 60% nationally, 57% nationally in the US. So that's a big misconception because we know unequivocally that humans are causing climate change and making it worse. So many among the public do not understand this. Do you think it will harm you personally? Only 47% in both Canada and the US. So people still don't see this as a problem that's happening right now. They're not linking the Canadian fires to climate change and smoke that's filling their lungs. So 54% yet still support taxes on carbon-based fuels in Canada. We have slightly different policy questions that we ask in the US. Mostly about renewable energy. There's very strong support for these. So this is the good news. Even though people may not understand that humans are contributing to the problem, they do support the transition to clean energy. However, most people are not talking about this. Only 35% say they talk about it occasionally or often with family and friends. And even fewer, 33%, the map looks almost the same, say they hear about it in the media at least once a week. So 2/3 of Americans at least say they do not hear about this issue once a week. So we're not really talking about it. And that's a problem because then it's not on the agenda. So just a couple more slides here. This is a study conducted by my colleagues that specifically looked at psychological distress by race, ethnicity, and gender and generation. And interestingly, I thought youth would be at the very top, but it's actually Hispanic and Latino respondents who expressed the most severe levels of distress, and then Gen Z and millennials second in this bar chart here. So about 10% experience psychological distress associated with climate change. So this was a study specifically of people who acknowledge psychological distress, but these numbers again reflect the national patterns. And I'm going to just leave you with this because this is showing you the percentage of people in different categories, ranging from those who are alarmed, who think this is a serious problem that demands urgent action right now, 28%, all the way to the other side, the dismissive group who thinks the earth is not warming, it's not happening, we don't need to do anything about it, this is all a hoax, scientists making up data, and so on. That's only 11%. Most people really underestimate this part of the spectrum. They do not realize that more than 50%, well over 50% of the public are alarmed or concerned. They think these groups are much bigger than they are. And in part, that's because nobody's talking about it and they're not hearing about it in the media. So there's this kind of pluralistic ignorance that's happening here, which is reinforcing this kind of spiral of silence. And the antidote to that is to talk about it like we're doing today. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to the other talks in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a real honor to be here with this amazing panel of speakers. I'm really delighted. And let's see if my slides are here. Yes. So as Brendan said, I'm working on the Environmental Performance Index, which is a composite indicator that measures many different aspects of how well countries are doing in environmental sustainability issues. And today, since we are talking about forest fires, I will focus on air pollution, climate change, and of course, on Canada's environmental performance. I must say, although Brendan said it already, that the EPI is a flagship project of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy that started over 20 years ago. And the center publishes a report every 2 years. The last one was in 2022. And I am in charge of the next one, the 2024 report that will come out this June. So stay in tune for that. As I said, the Environmental Performance Index covers many different topics. This pie chart shows the structure of the last EPI report that included 40 different indicators grouped in 11 different environmental issue categories, themselves grouped into 3 main pillars, or what we call policy objectives. One is climate change, namely the mitigation of climate change. The second is environmental health, which is how healthy the environment is for humans. And the third is ecosystem vitality, how well countries protect their ecosystems and their biodiversity and natural resources. In the last EPI, I must say that in each of these indicators, the EPI scores countries in a scale from 0 to 100, and then combines all of those scores with different weights as represented by the size of the wedges in this pie chart. So in the last EPI, Canada got an overall score of 50 out of 100, no? So right in the middle, and ranked out of 180 countries included in the EPI, ranked position 49. So that's actually relatively good, you could say. But Canada's performance was very uneven in these 3 main pillars. So in environmental health, Canada got a pretty good score of 86 out of 100. In ecosystem vitality, 53. And in climate change, 28. Okay, so you can see it's a very uneven performance, and let's see if we can figure out why. So as I mentioned, today I will focus on the environmental health and specifically air quality indicators, which is like the main component of the environmental health section, and also on climate change. So basically the good performance, the bad, and at the end I will also talk a bit about the ugly. So in air quality, I will focus on one of the indicators, the one that receives the largest weight, actually, which is an indicator that measures the public health effects of fine particulate matter pollution, this PM 2.5. That, as we heard from Professor Marlon, is one of the air pollutants that has the worst consequences for public health. what the 2022 EPI indicator actually measures is how many years of life adjusted by disability are lost in a country due to exposure to this fine particulate matter pollution for every 100,000 people in the population. So Canada, as you can see, got a pretty good score of 92, which corresponds to a daily rate is disability adjusted life years lost of only 142. So 142 years of life were lost due to exposure to this pollution in Canada. To put it in context, that same number in the US was 249. In China was 1700, and in India, 2700. So you can see that actually, in this sense, air quality in Canada is relatively good. So why am I focusing on fine particulate matter? As I said, this is considered the main environmental risk factor. And in the year 2019, it's estimated that 4.1 million people worldwide died prematurely due to exposure, long-term exposure to this particular type of pollution. To put it in context, in 2020, it is estimated that the COVID pandemic caused an excess mortality of more or less 3 or 3.5 million people. So this was in just this year worse than the COVID pandemic, right? So it's like a serious public health problem. And it's actually gotten better. It was worse a few years ago, but it's still extremely bad. But what is generating all of this pollution and indirectly killing so many people? A recent study, I'm citing it there in the low corner by McDuffie and collaborators from the Global Burden of Disease study that actually generates the data behind this indicator, attempted to partition different sources that contribute to fine particulate matter pollution and their health consequences. And they estimated that of these 4 million deaths worldwide, more or less 1 million deaths were the result of the burning of fossil fuels, mostly coal. Then more or less 0.77 million was from burning of biofuels like firewood or dung for heating and cooking. This is mostly in like poorer countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Then more or less 620,000 people died from pollution originated from wind-blown dust, like dust storms. And this is mostly in arid countries of Northern Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And fires? Well, fires, according to these estimates, contributed only to 0.2 million deaths. But of course, well, first of all, this assumes that all types of fine particulate matter are equally toxic. And there is some evidence, recent evidence that fine particulate matter from fires can be more toxic than other sources. So maybe this is an underestimation. But also the contribution of fires varies a lot from year to year, and its contribution is likely to increase over time with ongoing climate change, and especially as we move away from the burning of fossil fuels. So, for example, this paper mapped what are the dominant contributors to fine particulate matter pollution in different areas of the world. You can see here North America, and this black area is the region of North America where fires are the main contributor to fine particulate matter pollution. And you can see that all of Canada is colored like that. No? So fires are especially important in North America and in Canada, as well as in Central Sub-Saharan Africa. That pie chart over there also shows the different sources of fine particulate matter pollution in Canada. And you can see fires are like the main one, but closely followed by residential burning of firewood, as well as industry and agriculture. As I said, the relative contributions of fires to air pollution will increase with ongoing climate change. And that is a big problem. And I also want to talk a little bit about some very interesting feedbacks between fires and climate change, because as Professor Marlon already told us, climate change is making forest fires worse by extending the length of the fire season, making the weather warmer and drier. But also, fires contribute to climate change. I have a very similar figure to what we saw already. So here, these bar plots show the amount of carbon emissions from fires all around the world. And you can see that 2023, which is this year, the last one, was not extraordinary at the global level. Actually, there were more emissions from fires in some recent years. But in Canada, it was a complete outlier. You know, the emissions from forest fires in Canada in 2023 were like almost 5 times larger than the last record. So this is a pretty evident, clear way in which forest fires contribute to climate change, because all of those forests that are burning are releasing all of that carbon and CO2 and other gases to the atmosphere, and that contributes more and more to climate change. But there is another way in which fires contribute to climate change that is not so often appreciated. And that is that some of the pollutants from forest fires can be toxic to vegetation. This shows like how the forests from Canada contributed, as Professor Marlon already said, to almost a quarter of total emissions from forest fires in 2023. But you can also see that wind can take those emissions all around the world and have impacts very, very far away. So it's not just the carbon emissions, but that pollution can be toxic to vegetation in very distant places and inhibit the capacity of plants to do photosynthesis and absorb more carbon. So there is a very interesting study from 2018 from a couple of researchers that used to work at Yale, actually, that shows how ozone pollution, this is a different pollutant, but generated during forest fires, can inhibit the photosynthesis of plants and reduce the capacity of ecosystems to absorb more carbon, therefore further contributing to ongoing climate change. To put it in context again, I must say that this effect of fires is relatively modest compared to other human sources of ozone pollution. It's a bit blurry, but here you can see the total effect of ozone pollution on the capacity of ecosystems to absorb carbon, and like fires overall on average reduce this capacity by more or less 0.6%, but with all the other sources that can be almost 10 times more. So there is like a double whammy of fires on how they contribute to climate change. So given this, it's obviously very important that all nations, and including Canada, do everything that they can to mitigate the effects of climate change. So how is Canada doing on that respect? Well, I already told you, not very well. And it is actually lagging all of its rich industrialized peer nations and really failing at reduce the greenhouse emissions that it's emitting into the atmosphere. So these plots show how much emissions of different greenhouse gases different countries are emitting through time. The EPI indicators focus mostly on measuring the recent growth rates of these emissions, because we want to motivate countries to, wherever they are, reduce their emissions, because that's what we need to do to stop climate change. And you can see that Canada really has more or less stabilized its emissions, but not really reduced them in any consistent way during the last couple of decades. Even the US, which is not a very good climate performer by any means, has achieved like a more or less consistent reduction in recent years, and other like rich countries in Europe, like much more so, like the United Kingdom and Denmark or Germany. So with this data, Canada does very poorly in the EPI climate change indicators. But the sad thing, now I go to the ugly, is that the real situation might be even worse. Because, and maybe you have heard of this, there is a series of recent studies that have shown that emissions from Canada's oil sands or tar sands have been severely underestimated. And what the industry and countries are reporting to the global data sets of emissions that then we use to score Canada and other countries are not including a lot of emissions that are escaping from these tar sands. So scientists have discovered that by flying with airplanes above this and actually measuring the concentration of different gases. And they see that there is a mismatch between what has been reported and what actually is being emitted. So with this and with the extraordinary emissions during 2023 from forest fires, the climate performance of Canada is likely even worse than the EPA has been able to measure so far. So that's all I have for now, but I'm looking forward to answer any questions.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. And it's my great pleasure to be here. And thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did for the Canadian wildfire impacts and some of the background about it. And so as the previous speakers has been talking about, so we know the climate is changing. And last year was on record the warmest year. And the past January was also the warmest January on record. So we know climate change is happening. And as the previous two speakers says that climate change is fueling these wildfires. And in this particular event, there's a rapid assessment report by the World Attribution Studies showing that because of climate change, the extreme fire weather conditions that was making this Canadian wildfire happens was more than 2 times likely to happen. So yes, indeed, the Canadian wildfire event we're talking about today is driven by climate change. And I have a similar figure showing what's going on in terms of the air pollution. So here was just a matter of black carbon, which is one component of the particulate matter pollution that primarily from this kind of wildfires that can help us at least indicate where the wildfire smoke goes. And you also heard the news. Actually, we all experience it if you happen to be in New Haven, right? We not only see the orange sky, but we can smell it. So that actually tells you how bad it is. And we took a very quick, rapid assessment as well, just after this event. So we first look at the EPA has some fixed monitoring stations. And we look at all the monitoring stations in New York City, and we look at the data for the PM2.5. As Sebastian has informed you, it leads to more than 4 million deaths per year. And why we are looking at PM2.5, it is the #1 risk factor for environmental risk factors. And it was so small that the reason why we call it PM2.5 is this particulate matter pollution with an error diameter below 2.5 micrometer. It was so small that it was one of the 20th or 30th of a human hair. That means if it's not pollution, heavily polluted days, you won't see it. And it's until it's extremely polluted, like the orange sky, that it is so high that it affects the visibility. So that's why it makes this such a severe air pollution event as well. So we took this monitoring stations data, and if you plot on the time scale, this plot just shows what it is, right? So typically in New York City, the PM2.5 daily average level should be around or below 10 microgram per cubic meter. But during these smoke days, these 3 days from June 6 to June 9, and you can see the peak level can reach about 150 compared to normally you will get 8 or 9, right? So that tells you even without any complex causal inference of models, you know, okay, this is due to the Wi-Fi events, right? So over the past 2-3 decades, actually, in the public health, particularly in the field of what we call air pollution epidemiology, scientists have well known of the health effects of this particular matter pollution on all the organ systems. First, it started with the small particles that you can inhale into the lung, and some particles that are smaller enough can go into your lung, penetrate into the blood system, and circulate around the body. That can not only affect our respiratory system, but also affecting our cardiovascular system, goes to other systems, affecting renal system, influencing the reproductive system, and most recently, it shows that the fine particulate matter can even impact our brain, leading to increased Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but also impairing cognitive functions even in the children. So our group in the past few years has also done a lot of work in this field. Due to time limitation, I will just briefly mention what has been in the front line of what we know about these particles. So we talk a lot about the physical health, but actually this particular matter pollution can also impact our mental health. So for example, these 2 studies shows that these fine particulate matters can increase the emergency room visits for mental disorders, and they will make the pregnant women feel more stressed and have actually more impacts from this fine particulate matter during the heavy pollution events. Also, we found that some smaller particles that are small enough to impact the heart system that can trigger heart attacks. And also, these particles can also lead to significant increases in the kidney related conditions. We did several studies in China, but also recently in New York State. We found that this particular matter pollution can lead to significant increase for our kidney health. So based on that ground knowledge, we know this pollution is harmful. But the question is, can we actually be able to detect it right after what's happening? So one the challenge in doing that is obviously when Sebastian is talking about the 4 million deaths, that number is come from, first of all, you need to have complete death record. And second of all, you need to have conduct what we call cohort studies, that you basically follow people years or decades to find out if this long-term exposure to air pollution can actually make people die early or have developed some certain diseases. So obviously, we can't do that right after this event. And another major limitation of kind of doing this kind of rapid health assessment for these events is the data. So a lot of the health data, including hospital admissions data and mortality data, they usually have a fairly long time lag. We are talking about at least a year before you can have a more complete death record, or a year until you have a more complete hospitalization data. So we are very fortunate to collaborate researchers at Columbia University who has been working with New York City's near real-time syndrome system data. So we've been able to pull the near real-time emergency department visits data that give us the opportunity to take a look at, okay, what is the potential health impacts of this extreme Canadian Wi-Fi smoke event on the asthma visits. So if you pull the data, you can see also, we don't need any fancy statistics. It tells you during this event, you have peak in the asthma visits, right? So we then, of course, did another quick estimate. It shows roughly about 44% increase was observed during this smoke event. And that increase is observed across all the age categories. It's not that only older adults or young children are more vulnerable. Young adults are also more vulnerable. And if we look across the different boroughs, they are all impacted. So we are in the same boat, everyone. But there's also, of course, many other studies showing for this wildfire event as well. Here, just give you one example is about the same time, the CDC is also collecting their own data and conducting a study. One of the study is to utilize the same emergency department with data. And what they found is they are doing things slightly different than what we are, but they are still kind of relying on the EPA's air quality monitoring station's data to define the heat waves, to define the smoke waves. Here, as this is the June 6 to 8 smoke waves that we studied, they also detected, if you recall, there was also another smoke pollution happening in the late June or early July, although it was not that severe to turn the sky into orange. So they actually calculated both, and from that, there was about a 70% jump in the region that includes both New Jersey and New York. So we have multiple sources confirming that indeed we have seen a significant asthma increases during these Canadian wildfire events. But as I said, there's a lot of other potential health impacts from fire particulate matters. We're actually working on several studies, including looking at the whole United States. What are all the specific causes of deaths that can be attributed to wildfire smoke? And I can tell you that the number doesn't look very good. So we are having adverse health impact beyond just the respiratory system. And I hope next time I can share more about that information. Thank you.
All right, everybody, I'm going to turn the floor over and begin part two for our keynote presenter, Professor Min. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you to everybody for being here today. And I'm really delighted to be actually having the event in this building, because 27 years ago, I got a job on the ground floor in room 135, working for two visiting professors who were writing a book on migration from Haiti, a country that I was not at all familiar with. And that would be the start of my interest in Haiti and the beginning of my research on health and international interventions there. So it seems like a good sign today that I'm able to present some emerging research and some new directions in what I'm working on now. And when Jay asked me to speak at today's event, he might have been expecting me to present on the health impacts of the 2023 wildfires, given my affiliation with the University of Montreal School of Public Health. And instead, I propose to talk about my emerging research on why young heterosexual Quebecois men are deciding not to have children. And the fact that he accepted my counteroffer is a testament to his openness as an intellectual, and an openness that you might be irritated with if you are not interested in fertility or demography. So if that's the case, the first take-home message is blame Jay. And the second take-home message is that when young men in Quebec talk about not having children, they do talk about climate change and its impending impacts, but they also have a lot to say about other subjects, including masculinity, transmission, immigration, and nationalism. So I won't be covering all of these topics today, but I do want to think about what smoke from Canada does, how it blurs horizons, how it crosses borders, and warns of impending doom. So I will start with a brief discussion of the 2023 wildfires from a Quebec perspective, and then I will talk about climate change, environmental catastrophes, and current socioeconomic conditions, how they are drawing anthropologists' attention towards the future. Finally, I will present the case of fertility decline in Quebec and how the specifics of voluntary childlessness there might help us understand broader global patterns. I feel like we've seen a lot of images like this today. And you see the fires on the right side. This was taken in early June of 2023. So my information about the 2023 wildfires comes from interviews with a forestry engineer at Quebec's Ministry of Forests, Fauna, and Parks, which is a branch of the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources. So in terms of the scope for the province of Quebec, we're talking about 40,000 square kilometers or 4 million hectares. And that's the size of Connecticut and Massachusetts combined. Quebec is 166 million hectares, the whole territory. And so about 4 million of that burned. And this was really unprecedented in scope for the province. And this engineer placed a lot of emphasis on the specificity of forests in Quebec in the North American context. And given our distinct society, you're probably not surprised to hear that we also have distinct forests. The historical record of wildfires in Quebec and Eastern Ontario don't quite correspond with those in the western parts of the continent, where the suppression of periodic burns caused either by lightning strikes or indigenous stewardship practices is believed to have contributed to mega fires. So essentially, the politics of putting out fires so quickly whenever they arise in California and Oregon and Alberta has led to the accumulation of combustibles in a way that it leads to mega fire complexes that are much harder to control. The evidence available from Quebec suggests that the fires would cycle through at a much, much lower frequency, essentially because the environment is quite humid, and especially areas east of the Lac Saint-Jean region, which is around here. So there it's suspected that very large fires would burn every 1,000 years. My engineer informant also highlighted how untroubled Quebec's population was by the fires. People in the southern parts of the province, including the city of Montreal and the 6 next largest cities in Quebec, where the majority of Quebecers reside, were seemingly unaffected by these massive fires. They were, of course, mentioned in media outlets, but rarely as front page items, particularly in the early weeks. Things briefly changed on the morning of June 25th, when Montrealers woke up to the smoke and haze that had blanketed parts of the US nearly 3 weeks before. And so we were getting news about New York, for example, when our skies were still blue and we weren't smelling anything. And I remember the morning of June 25th, I was telling Dr. Chen that I woke up at 6 and smelled smoke. And it reminded me of cooking fires in Haiti. And I was wondering why somebody in my neighborhood was having a barbecue at 6 in the morning, because we'd been hearing about the fires for so long, but we hadn't smelled anything. The air quality, of course, had been affected, but not in a ways that we were taking particular notice of it. So much was made of that. The fact that Montreal's air quality on that day was deemed the worst in the world. So we were competing with New York, and the comparisons would always go up with Calcutta or with other parts of the world. But public attention turned elsewhere as the smoke dissipated. And so for my engineer informant, she claims for most Quebecois, the scope and distances involved in understanding the fires and even Quebec's territory at all were and are simply unfathomable. As she said, l'échelle est démesurée. So literally the scale is unscalable or unmeasurable in terms of the size of the territory, and the places where people in Quebec will travel on a daily basis, or even to go visit friends, families, relatives, recreation, etc., do not come anywhere near to covering the scope of the fires or the province. So climate change is a central concern for young people in Quebec, but for many of them, it remains an abstract issue experienced through the protections of built environments. So decreasing snowfall and snow accumulation are often measured in terms of the height of snowbanks relative to automobiles. People have adjusted their toilets and taps to reduce water consumption, but we remain among the world's top consumers and wasters of fresh water. Unlike the communities where I worked in rural Haiti, where people lost their homes and lives in increasingly violent hurricanes during the rainy seasons and occasionally died of thirst during the dry seasons, the most troubling impacts of climate change in Quebec seem distant, both geographically and temporally. The 2023 fire, it's important to note, did not lead to any loss of human lives in Quebec or damage to strategic infrastructures. They prompted the evacuation of about 27,000 people, which is 0.03% of the province's population. And many of those people were from First Nations communities who remain woefully marginalized in Quebec's Euro-dominated society. Despite all of this, we know that climate change does remain a top concern for young people in Quebec, whether it's framed as éco-anxiété or éco-colère, eco-anger. The affective dimensions of responses to climate change are both immediately present and lying beyond the blurry horizons. So the fact that the lived impacts of cataclysmic climate change are temporarily distant for many young Quebecers means that their engagements with it are based on futurity. And this relationship to what lies ahead is at the heart of my research. How do young people in Quebec imagine their individual and our collective, national, and planetary futures? Anthropologists have a much stronger tradition of studying the past than they do the future, but a confluence of factors have led to a growing number of scholars centering the future in their research. Jane Geyer, who recently passed away, invited us to study how we conceptualize ourselves in the transitional modes of apocalypse and emergence. She provides the concept of anticipation, building on a Paderais use of the term to describe how it, quote, opens up both of the vistas, the directions of change, and the concepts of the process and pattern of change, going on to the broader and deeper indeterminacy that has moved into the space previously described as the near future with its punctuated time. Another anthropologist, Adriana Petrina, describes horizoning, a mode of reckoning that considers unnatural disasters against a horizon of expectation in which people and societies can act. And she coincidentally uses the case of wildfire science, whose existing models were created for conditions that no longer exist. In the case I'm presenting today, the existing models in question are family models. Sorry, this was the slide where Montreal was presented as the most polluted city in the world. And in terms of family models, like many other societies, Quebec has experienced a steep decline in fertility over the last 2 centuries. And it's a particularly interesting example with which to think about fertility decline because of how it exists in people's imaginations, both in empirical and mythical terms. So an American doctor with a French-Canadian last name once told me that all French Canadians were descended from 100 French settler colonists who arrived in Canada in the 1600s. And myself, I contributed to these myths up until a few years ago. I would regularly tell American friends who visited me in Montreal that fertility in Quebec had been the highest in human history at 11.4 per woman, a rate which was only surpassed by the Hutterites. I don't remember where I first heard this statistic, but it made sense to me given that I grew up with 2 adopted aunts, one of whom was the 5th of 9 children, and the other was the 7th of 12, so very much looking like these families. I knew plenty of other francophone families, formerly Catholic, for whom this was the case, and accepting this statistic without much critical perspective, because it made a good story, I neglected to factor in situations like my own mother's, who was also an outlier as an only child in the 1930s. So here you have the kind of family that's often portrayed in media. This was about a family of 16 children that were born starting in 1936, and the last child was born in 1959. 16 of them who were all alive in 2019, and they were planning a big family reunion that appears to never have happened, perhaps interrupted by the COVID pandemic. It's always a question when we talk about Quebec, when we go outside of Quebec, do we or do we not mention Celine? Let's put her here. There she is right in the middle, and she is the youngest of 12 children. So after looking more seriously for information about fertility in the province, I found a nuanced portrait and an area of intense debate. So the issue has been, not surprisingly, studied mostly by Quebec demographers. And their estimates of historical fertility rates range from a peak of between 5 and 7 births per woman in the mid-19th century, with rates decreasing into the baby boom of the 1950s, which in Quebec was caused by total numbers of births, not by rising fertility. And then the decline swiftly increasing in the 1960s, which is a pattern similar to the rest of Canada and to the United States. It remains that the French-Canadian population, particularly those in the 17th and 18th century, were often used alongside 20th century Hutterites by demographers as an example of unusually high fertility rates. So this comes up in a lot of classic studies from the 1950s and 60s. And this purportedly high rate was and is also used to explain why and how francophones were able to continue their existence on an Anglo-dominant continent. And another statistic that gets trotted out was that with the English conquest of New France, at the time there were as many francophones in New France as there were Dutch speakers in New York and German speakers in Pennsylvania, with the ... look what happened to those other linguistic communities. So this decline in fertility is sometimes celebrated as part of social and political gains for women, or as a liberation from the Catholic Church's hold on Quebec society. However, it is often decried as a sign of individualism and collective decline. So here's the lyrics of a very popular song in 2006 by a kind of neo-traditional music group, Mes Aïeux. And it talks about both labor practices and birthing practices. So talking about the great-great-grandfather who cleared the land, plowed the land, your grandfather made money off the land, and then your father sold it to become a bureaucrat. And then singing to young women, your great-great-grandmother had 14 children, your great-grandmother had almost as many, your grandmother had 3, that was enough, and your mom didn't want you, you were an accident. Back talking to the young man, you don't know what you want to do. You live in a small apartment, too expensive, cold in the winter. You want to become a landowner or a homeowner, and you dream of having a small piece of land. And you, my little girl or my girl, you're always changing partners. When you make mistakes, you get out of it with abortions, but there's mornings where you wake up crying and you dream of a table surrounded by children. So this song extremely criticized, and this group has never quite apologized for kind of the undertones of its message, but they also do sing about climate change. If you're interested in listening to it, I suggest you do it as your own risk because it's quite an earworm. It's very repetitive. So before I go any further, I should be very clear in stating that I do not see fertility decline or voluntary childlessness in Quebec as either a negative or a positive trend. I have stakes as both an insider and an outsider in this project. I'm a Quebecer with French, Acadian, and Korean roots, a francophone who was born in Montreal but was raised in the United States, educated in English. I'm a cisgendered gay man who, like many gay people, was raised with the expectation that I would be heterosexual. And finally, I'm a parent, but I chose adoption rather than biological reproduction. So my informants for this project, the young straight Quebecois men, are both very familiar and very strange to me. They could both be members of my extended family and people that I have virtually nothing in common with. The driving force for this project is curiosity. In starting the research, I really had no idea what my informants would have to say to me. And a lot of people in my professional and social network would say, well, they're young men, they're not thinking about reproduction, which I suspected was not true. I've been able to draw from a rich body of anthropological literature on reproduction, which for good reasons has focused mainly on the experiences and perspectives of women. A growing number of scholars, including Marcia Inhorn here at Yale, have been studying men's experiences with reproduction, infertility, and reproductive technologies. And I'm also able to draw on work by queer theorists, including those who have examined queer kinship and queer futures, which may or may not involve parenthood and children. So my informants so far, and I'm working with a very small group to begin with, have been very fascinating to listen to. One thing has been certain: climate change is both the most and the least important reason why young Quebec men when they talk about not having children. To clarify, they mention climate change. They're pessimistic about the future. They know it's the most important factor. And if you noticed with Professor Marlin's charts that were showing Canada, Quebec, as it often does, is an outlier in terms of people's concerns, people's pessimism about climate change. So it's definitely something that they are thinking and talking about. And yet it also seems to prop up a decision that has other legs supporting it. These include never having seen oneself as a parent. So one informant who said, I never decided not to have children. It's that I never decided to have children. For him, the default, and as long as he can remember, he was not going to become a parent. Others say that they want to live without having to make sacrifices. And there's a lot of interesting discourse about selfishness, where they know they're being accused of selfishness by others who say, well, you're selfish because you just want to live for yourself. You're focusing only on your desires, your career, your projects. And a counter discourse from these informants saying that the people who are having a lot of kids are selfish because they're the ones who want to reproduce their genetic material essentially and have a continuity that's taking up resources that others could have. And then finally, they've seen their own parents try not to pass on violence, anger, sicknesses that had been inherited from their grandparents and sometimes are failing to do so. So oftentimes these decisions are at the forefront, but climate change, even though it subsumes and overshadows all of these issues in scope, is a much easier and morally valued reason to not have children. It makes for shorter conversations and it leads to consensus, at least among the crowds my informants seem to run in. I also asked my informants about nationalism and what it means for them to renounce reproduction as members of a majority-minority group that has long promoted a discourse of cultural and linguistic survival through numbers, and this has been for generations. I remain curious about the future of Quebec nationalism because it doesn't fit into an archetypal narrative, either victorious nor tragic. Franco-Ontarian journalist Francine Pelletier recently published an essay tracing the last 50 years of nationalism in Quebec, which she experienced firsthand. She came to Montreal in the early 70s and has been tracking as a journalist and a social commentator the changes. So according to her version, Quebec nationalism had early alliances with labor unions, feminist movements, environmental groups, and post-colonial struggles, and has now declined, leading to the current CAQ government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, which promotes an identity-based, xenophobic, fear-mongering nationalism. Young people in Quebec who were born after the second referendum on Quebec sovereignty in '95 have grown up in a context of contradictions. Support for sovereignty has hovered around 30 to 40% in recent decades, and yet the sovereignty issue is only occasionally prominent in the public sphere, greatly overshadowed by climate change, global geopolitics, and economic concerns. A recent poll found that Quebecers were the most likely of all Canadians to agree with the statement, Canada is on the right track. That's 46% for the province versus 36% for the national average of all of Canada. For young Quebecers, the provincial government has been a strong presence in their daily lives, managing education, health services, welfare, infrastructure, public culture, natural spaces, and other spheres. In terms of parenting and raising children, Quebec is well known for its generous parental leaves, subsidized childcare, which ranges from about 150 to 250 Canadian dollars a month per child, and low university tuition for in-province students at around 3,800 Canadian a year in all Quebec universities. So, you know, whether it's Université de Montréal, Université du Québec à Chicoutimi ou McGill, residents of Quebec will all be paying these relatively low tuition rates. However, the COVID pandemic brought to light an enormous failing in Quebec's system of social services. The CHSLD, or Hospital Centers for Long-Term Care, these could be considered the epicenter of COVID deaths in Quebec, and reporting on them in the early days of the pandemic brought abuses and neglect into the public sphere, with stories of filth, isolation, and violence. Individuals without children were considered particularly vulnerable, with no one available to lobby on their behalf. The protagonists in this story became the immigrant workers, who are statistically overrepresented as caregivers in such settings. Both the workers themselves and dominant media portrayals often relied on tropes of imagined qualities such as caring, nurturing, family values, and respect for elders in describing immigrants to Quebec. My Quebecois French-Canadian informants are currently watching their grandparents, great aunts, and uncles age, and they're aware of the role their own parents play in securing a decent quality of life for the generation above them. This seems to be the most concrete and pressing drawback for the decision to remain childlessness. The consequences of climate change beyond a blurry horizon. Sorry, the consequences of climate change lie beyond the blurry horizon, but the path to old age is clear and an inevitable focus. One of the things I found the most appealing about this research is that it's still not clear where exactly it'll be taking me. For example, I talked about how disconnected many people in Quebec were from the fires. In terms of citizen engagement, however, some of the people who were the most concerned and engaged, aside from the people who lived in the burning areas, were the people who hunt and fish. And I'm not talking about First Nations populations here, but rather recreational people who don't live in these parts of the territories, but will travel to it during the summer and fall specifically for these recreational activities. And they were among the most vocal critics of government policies that closed off large areas of forested lands during the fires. And they developed anti-government conspiracy theories related both to the fires and the land closures. So claims that the government was setting the fires intentionally, or that this was involved somehow with mining industries and protecting mining interests, etc. Thus, we have critiques of the government from another branch of the political spectrum, not just the people who are opposed to identity-based national politics, but a population who is actually more familiar with the land and is using it on a more regular basis than urban environmental activists. So whether or not they choose to have children, young people in Quebec will be determining their relationships to land, state, and nations in a context of heightened insecurity. And this last image, I like to present because you have a mix of symbols here. You have groups that are protesting different laws. This was around tuition hikes in Quebec from 2011, 2012, and 2013. And the spring period of 2012 was referred to as le printemps arabe, a wordplay on le printemps arabe, or the Arab Springs, the Maple Springs. And what started off as protest against tuition hikes ended up encompassing things about police brutality, about different forms of legislation for minority communities, etc. And most of my informants kind of came of age politically during these periods. They were either in high school or in Cégep, Quebec's mandatory junior colleges. And so a lot of them will talk about this period of time when they started making connections around nation, environment, economics, and what kind of future they would have. So, thank you very much.
We have plenty of time. Does anyone want to get us started off? Please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very curious on how the kind of, especially in the Quebec context, how things differ between kind of more like the Anglophone side of Quebec versus the Francophone side, both politically, but also just socially.
So the question is asking about divisions within Quebec society among the broader Francophone population and the Anglo minority in this context.
In this context, there's so many parts where we could look into that, just in terms of different forms of identity, the idea of how people imagine the different state structures that there are in their lives, whether it's federal or whether it's provincial. If we just look at in terms of childlessness and fertility, Quebec is actually not among the lowest in terms of provinces and fertility. I believe it's among provinces and territories, it's third highest. So all of Canada, the fertility rate is below replacement level, which is 2.1, right? And in Quebec right now, it's turning at around 1.49. So it's significantly under it, and it's been so for a while. it's interesting, you know, this kind of constant issue of Quebec within Canada, Canada with or without Quebec, and Quebec exceptionalism. So I would say in terms of reproduction, in terms of awareness about or people thinking about the future, I think that there would be a lot of parallels. And what I found interesting, I'm just thinking about one informant who said, I was asking him about nationalism and about loyalties either to Quebec or Ottawa and feelings of belonging to these imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson would have described them. And he said, you know, he's like, it really depends on the parties in power and what kind of values they have. If they have progressive values, if they have things that I believe in, I will lean towards a separatist party, but I won't lean towards them because they are separatist. Whereas if there's a party that is very federalist and I agree with what they're doing, then I will vote for them. So I think for many people, it's no longer the kind of pivot issue or wedge issue that it had been historically. So that might be one way of looking at it. One of the things I'm also hoping to do as part of this project is to work with Acadian communities, specifically on Prince Edward Island in New Brunswick, because they're Quebec's a majority minority community in the province, but in the Maritimes, Acadians, as we know, represent a smaller percentage of the population. And the questions about linguistic and cultural continuity there take on a totally different tone just because of the numbers. So it's easy to forget, you know, about the François, the Franco-Albertain, and then the Acadians back on the east side. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. There's some other question for Pierre. Could you elaborate, please, on your sample? You know, what's on the demographics? What's the age group? You know, what's the you know, just give us more of an idea. And also, are they saying they don't want relationships, or are they saying they want relationships but no children? And are they saying they want to get married or not?
Mm-hmm. So I can start with the last part. The marriage question is very interesting because marriage in Quebec and francophone communities is very much associated with church-sanctioned marriage. So the idea of civil marriages that don't involve a priest is a relatively new phenomenon. And I remember I was going to lots of weddings in my 20s and 30s and families in the US, et cetera. And I accumulated 30 some weddings, and people in Quebec were like, are you friends with people who are just like really conservative and religious? And I said, no, like these are outdoor weddings. These are weddings celebrated by friends. And for them, it was very strange because they say, well, if you don't go to church, why do you get married, right? And that is starting to change, but I think it's also related to the United States' wedding industrial complex, as it gets called sometimes, and all of the economics around wedding ceremonies. And also, you know, Quebec has had very early kind of progressive common law structure. So that's one aspect. In terms of sample, I am aiming for young men essentially between 18 and 30. I'm looking for men who are not talking about this as, oh, I didn't have kids and it didn't work out that way and I might have. I'm looking more for people who are intentionally saying, I do not want to reproduce biologically. And apparently some of them are getting vasectomies, although there's a lot of debates in the vasectomy clinics saying whether or not they will or will not do vasectomies on young men who have not had kids. This also brings up issues around whether or not vasectomies are in fact reversible, and then people have to calculate their risk because they are, but they aren't, and then the issue of regret, so how people imagine a future emotion. I'm not at all aiming for a representative sample. I hope to be talking to people. Most of the people that I've talked to now are in Montreal, but hoping to leave the city of Montreal, where just preliminary conversations have led me to believe that this is less of an it's less of a phenomenon outside of the cities, this discourse around specifically not wanting to have kids. And at the end, I'll be aiming for about 25, 30 informants when I have some saturation. So it's qualitative, ethnographically informed research that can open up pilot studies on a larger scale, because there's very, very little information that has been done about this. There's been some studies of voluntary childlessness among women, but among heterosexual men, very few and none that have taken place in Quebec. So we don't really even know what's out there in terms of what to ask. Yeah. And the last thing is being able to do local anthropological fieldwork means that I can also follow up with people, because people say, well, what if they change their minds? What if they have kids eventually? That doesn't bother me at all. Again, I'm not leaning, kind of one way or another. And if they do change their minds, I may be able to stay in touch with them, because chances are they'll be staying in the local area. And then we can talk about those changes in 5 or 10 years. But for the time being now, I'm aiming for folks who have a strong intention to not reproduce.
Pierre, thank you all, first of all. Pierre, you may not remember this, but many years ago in the Quebec and Canada class, there was an article we read called The Cultural Fatigue of French Canada by Hubert. And so there was a sense from this article, from this essay, very profound essay, that there was already a sense of like, I'm tired of being me. I'm tired to have to reproduce the culture. That old phrase, relance de berceau, is like why I have to keep, it's such a struggle. What I think I hear you saying, but this makes this a question for everybody, is that to a degree, climate change is almost an easy way of getting off the hook of it's like, well, there are so many things that bother me. Climate change is almost, it seems so obvious, like, no, I think I don't want to reproduce because climate change, and that stops the conversation. It's like, that's almost easier. So to extend this question to the whole panel, to what degree, maybe, because I hadn't even thought of this until I heard your presentations, it's like, is climate change almost functioning as a kind of shorthand for a general anxiety about whether we should reproduce?
Please.
I can comment. I was really struck by that point as well, because there is such consensus in Quebec and compared to the rest of Canada in terms of being concerned and worried about climate. And I think, just the idea that there's strong consensus around this issue among some communities is really important, because in the US we have these echo chambers, right, where there's consensus among the people most concerned, but then extreme polarization the minute you start to extend beyond those circles. But I do think it is it can be a kind of shorthand, because it is something we all, many of us know about, we talk about, it encompasses so many different impacts, and I think it's maybe just kind of a catch-all. I hadn't really thought about it, but since you mentioned it, and it is a good question, and I'm not even sure how one would study that, but I could certainly see it being plausible that people sort of use this to stand in for many of the other issues that we're facing, environmentally related and beyond, but I don't know how we would study that exactly.
Also, this is totally not my area, but what I can comment on is we do see some more and more evidence showing climate change impacts on anxiety, especially climate grief, climate anxiety, that especially happening in the case of young adults. And one of my colleagues, Professor Sarah Lowe at the Yale School of Public Health, is actually working a lot in this area. And one particular study she did is, I think she did a survey among the Yale college students. I think it's a positive aspect of that survey shows that if you feel like anxiety due to climate change, taking collective actions can help alleviate that. For example, if you participate in group discussion or even going out together as a group, participating in some some kind of events all together, that can help reduce that anxiety. So that's my limited knowledge on that. What I want to add a second piece on is more like from the physiological perspective, that we actually are seeing more and more evidence showing extreme temperature, extreme heat, and air pollution can affect the reproductivity. So we see air pollution can actually affecting the quality of the sperm, and we see the effects on the fertility rate as well. So I'm talking about not from people's own perspective, but more talking about the physiologically, climate change may also be linked to this issue.
Can I add one more thought here? You're reminding me that there have been some prominent scientific publications saying that the most important or impactful thing you can do is to not have children to address climate change, right? I think what has frustrated me a little bit about that is just the emphasis it puts on the individual and on talking about this as if we know a lot about the uncertainties, in decades into the future, which we don't. There are huge uncertainties. But also just to build on one of your points, in terms of what we do know about the relationship between climate anxiety and effort is that while we are seeing a rise in anxiety, we do find that those people are more likely to take action as well. And so we've analyzed the alarmed segment of the 6 Americas. It's about 28% of the American public right now. And if you break that group into thirds, it's about a third who are very anxious, who are actually acting and taking more actions than other groups like donating or volunteering or talking about it. A third of that 28% say they would like to do more, but they are, can't, or they don't know what to do. And then a third say they're very worried, but they're not going to do anything about it for various reasons. So it's a diverse group, but there is this kind of link between anxiety and action. It's called practical anxiety, where you're taking that worry and turning it into action.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add because, of course, I'm not an expert. I just can share that as a young, well, not so young, I think I'm above your demographic now, but I also sometimes consider this personally, oh, should I have kids? Because I suffer from climate anxiety. I work studying the effects of climate change and other environmental crises every day, and it affects my mood a lot. So yeah, I have struggled with this. At the end, I decided that yes, I want to have kids because I also saw that study that said yeah, the best thing you can do is not to have kids, but I don't totally buy it. I think it's more important to reduce the impact that each person has rather than to say, let's reduce the number of people, because that can be very problematic. And I still think that life is wonderful and there's a lot that humans can do and have to do to address these issues, right? So. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I think I want to add one kind of follow-up source for what Jim mentioned. If people may argue that not having kids may help reduce the carbon emission, but I want to provide an example study we did during the COVID-19. So you remember in early 2020 when we first had the severe virus spread, what we did? Lockdowns. So everyone stayed at home. What happens? We see the clean air. And we did some analysis showing in some places, yes, indeed, in the early phases, the very short period, the lockdown indeed lowers air pollution as a result, reduce potential health damages from the air pollution. We did one of the earliest studies shows in China, the early kind of nationwide lockdown can likely prevent thousands of deaths avoided from the air pollution reduction. But is this saying that to reduce air pollution, we should all get locked down?
Right.
Obviously not, right? So this is not sustainable and not healthy either, right? We have all other issues during lockdowns. So I think it's kind of similar to the situation, although it solves the problem partially, but it's not the whole picture. And it's definitely not a sustainable way as a human society.
Sorry, just to add to that also, because it's very interesting, during the lockdowns, the skies got clearer, the air pollution improved, but global greenhouse emissions dropped by around 5% only, right? At the peak of the lockdowns, where air traffic and most transportation was extremely reduced, And that shows that there are like bigger fish in the ponds. Right?
And if I can come back to your question, Jay, about the fatigue of reproducing culture, it made me think about a couple things. Number one, part of the story around young people in urban Quebec is that they have been exposed to a very new and recent phenomenon that previous generations did not encounter, and that's migration from France, which is fascinating. Since the early 2000s, large numbers, tens of thousands of people are coming from France to Quebec because they say France is terrible right now, right? They're not in line with the political situation. They say it's hard to find jobs. Graduate school in Quebec is going to be much more interesting. And there's this whole discourse around how people in France, that their English is not very good because their films are dubbed and English education is not prioritized, and they're not learning to speak English, kind of comfortably and fluidly. And of course, this is exaggerated, but many of them will say that they're happy to be in Quebec because they can stay in their language and they have professional opportunities. And so this has done a lot to change the environment around linguistic security, around how people speak and how they feel comfortable speaking. And one of the first things that struck me after I moved back to Quebec was meeting young Quebecois people who did not change their accent when they met someone from France. And this was very striking to me because this was something that my mother always did when we were growing up. You meet someone from France and you shift your accent. You do not sound Quebecois. You change as much as you can to a standard accent. And I saw people in universities meeting, professors or graduate students from France and speaking with their Quebecois accent. They would still speak formally, but they wouldn't try to shift their accent at all. So it's hard to put my finger exactly on what's going on, but I would think of it in terms of cultural reproduction as a confidence. The idea, the discourse still gets trotted out that French is in danger, but it's not something that you hear from people as much as you hear in media or government reports before elections and kind of whipping things up. And the type of linguistic corrections that earlier generations describe, a whole system of tokens among primary school kids. If they used an accent, if they used a borrowed word from English, an anglicisme, that the kids would police each other for tokens. And if you heard someone say a word that wasn't pronounced standard, you could ask them for a token. And the child who had the most tokens at the end of the week got a reward, and the child who had lost their tokens got punishment. I mean, this would be absolutely unthinkable today, right? And so just thinking about these little examples that surround us in terms of shift and in terms of the confidence that I feel among a lot of the people that I'm talking to, that Quebec in French is going to continue and that it is no longer dependent on having a huge number of children, whether it's around francophone migrants or whether it's around, just connectivity that allows for different forms of language utilization.
We've got a couple questions on the queue online, so I'm going to tie them together. I believe both will open up for all panelists. The first asks, how much was the difference in the pollution rates in the US and Canada dependent on the fracking revolution in the United States vis-a-vis what did or did not happen in Canada, particularly in relation to overall coal use at coal plants more broadly. And the second also asks an institutional question. So Canada has been long known as a nation of hewers of wood and drawers of water. Take the Maritimes, with Halifax as the only larger city. There's a big debate about the most effective way to minimize environmental impact. Is it to build up a restricted area and into one place, or is it to encourage widespread self-contained communities? Is this a distraction from the broader project? As the question, or is this central to the picture? So either of those questions, anyone want to take a stab at, or both, tie it together yourself?
Oh my God. I'm not sure. I know that most of the gains in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, both in Canada and in the US, have been due to a shift from coal energy production to natural gas. Coal is the dirtiest of fossil fuels, both in terms of greenhouse emissions, but also air pollution. It's just terrible. So that has helped a little bit in both countries, but I don't know exactly the comparison. I don't have the information at hand, so if I could follow up later, I could help get the data. I don't know if someone has something to add. And the other one was about what is the best way to protect the environment.
So in a specific like local policy dispute, do you want to build up a restricted area for where the worst environmental impact will happen, particularly in a city like we were talking about the Maritimes earlier, Halifax being the largest of the maritime cities, or is it to diffuse it? Is this debate itself productive, or is it more of a distraction from bigger concerns? Is the question.
Someone wants to start now. Again, I mean, I'm not sure. I think there's it's similar to one of the largest debates in ecology, which is actually my background, which is it's better to concentrate, for example, agriculture, make it super intensive and try to produce as much food as you can in a small area of land so that you can leave more land for nature and other species, or it's better to have more eco-friendly organic agriculture that might not be as productive but will require more land. Ecologists have been debating this for decades, and most of the evidence say that it might be better to just concentrate the impacts in a small area, but it's actually quite context dependent, as everything in ecology and environmental science. So you probably need like a mix of both. So perhaps it's actually a distraction to focus too much on that like dichotomy, I would say, but I don't know if someone wants to add.
So thanks. I'm not from ecology, but I do have an environmental science background, so I do try to answer that. So this is a great question, thinking about different ways can help regulate environmental pollution. But I think in the environmental policy, it is I rarely see this as a case to help reduce the environmental pollution, especially for today. We talk a lot about air pollution, and as Sebastian mentioned, coal burning emissions is the major one. So what I see is indeed we need the government policies to help regulate and help reduce the air pollution, rather than of course there may be some ecosystem that can help us. For example, we know a little bit that green space can help lower the air pollution, can help lower the health effects of air pollution. But how much would that actually can do to reduce the full extent of the health effects of air pollution? So I think the fundamental goal has to be lower the air pollution emission. And we know that air pollution and climate change, they are the two sides of the same coin, because coal burning, fossil fuel burning contributes both to air pollution and climate change. So what we actually need is the clean energy to kind of phase out the coal and the fossil fuels.
Yeah, I'll just add one thought that just occurred to me, which is that in the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we probably won't have a lot of choice, just because as we rebuild our grid and transform our grid, we need to get solar and wind from much more rural areas, and hydro and turbines offshore. Like, our energy is going to come from many more diversified and varied sources around the country, and so part of this is just beyond our control in terms of where we're getting our energy anyway. And there are lots of local fights, of course, breaking out now. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, or YIMBYism, yes, in my backyard, these kinds of debates. But yeah, I think there are parallels in various dimensions of this. Did you have could I ask a quick question to Pierre? It's sort of related. I was just wondering about the occupations of the people that you're talking to, and whether any of them work for the fossil fuels, or there was how much variation there was, or
No, they don't work for the fossil fuels in a sense. And I think it could be very interesting to follow up with folks who have gone to Alberta from Quebec, because many of them did and are stayed there essentially, which is also an interesting series of identity questions, because the Franco-Albertan communities, many of them which would have been really starting in bigger number in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but then over the last 100 years have been, kind of fighting the fight of saying, well, we want to keep our schools open, we want to keep our churches open, we want our kids to speak French. But then you've had this influx of workers, many of them from Quebec, also from Ontario and the Maritimes, who have been working in fossil fuels. No, the folks that I'm working with have been in a diversity of industry. Some of them are in tech, some of them are in biopharmaceuticals, some of them are independent artists. And so it's quite a mix. And then it's, in terms of both the energy question and the idea of comparing with fracking, is to always remember the place that Hydro-Quebec has for Quebec nationalism and Quebec identity, that it was such a huge turning point in terms of creating an identity around power that could eventually even get sold to the United States, right? And René Lévesque's project of nationalizing hydro and how what that meant for the people. I did not live through the process, but the people who did talk about it still today as something that was really a major turning point in terms of the relationship between the province and the federal government. And these hydro projects, most people in southern Quebec have never seen them. They do not know what they look like. They have not traveled on that territory. And the whole relationship with the land is so interesting, because it will show up in people's poetry. It will show up in literature and different representations, when in fact, a lot of people don't go to the areas, and what has been the major conversation around the hydro projects has been relationships with Iwichi and the James Bay Cree. So different Native communities on the land, and how they have negotiated contracts over time with the provincial government. It's very interesting, but because they are in areas with very low population density, the discussions are often happening about a place that's over there. Yeah.
Other questions?
I mentioned the 70% of the US citizens that think climate change is a problem. Do you think that's a ceiling? That can have the increase?
I hope not. No, I don't think it's a ceiling. I think there is like a 10%. I think we could actually get up to 80 or 90%, as they have in Canada. But I do think there is a ceiling. I'm not sure where it is. It has been surprisingly stable. But I think, there is also this slow upward trend. Yeah, I guess we will see.
Too slow.
Okay. It is too slow.
I really enjoyed this panel. I learned so much. And I have to say, thank you so much, Pierre, for doing the kind of work we really need in the anthropology of reproduction, where we always talk to women, we rarely talk to men. And so I can tell you, I did a recent study on egg freezing in America, why women are freezing their eggs. It's all about the men. They cannot figure out what's going on with American men. They can't partner with them. They can't reproduce with them. So, I mean, it's a great study that you're doing. I just wanted to say, I mean, it's sort of devastating to hear, the presentations, especially the three of you gave about the fires. And I was really thinking about the fires and the fact that 2023 seemed to be a super bad fire year for Canada. And I guess the question is this an inevitability that we're just going to have worse and worse fires in a huge nation like Canada? Or are there any ways you can mitigate, the futurity of these kinds of devastating forest fires, and actually the health effects too? I mean, like simple masking or something. But, is there a discussion along those lines, like what can we do to prevent such a bad year next year? Or is it just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse? I'm curious, because we didn't really talk about that in the panel.
Right. No, we didn't mention one factor, and maybe you can speak more to this, Sebastian, but we did not talk about the fact that this was an El Nino year. So that's El Nino is natural climate variability superimposed on the background trend, and El Nino cycles every 5 to 7 years. It lasts for a year or two. And so although the relationship between El Nino and the Canadian fires are somewhat complicated, this summer was incredibly warm because in part of El Nino. So we do not expect actually to see a similar event like that, or I would not expect that anything quite as extreme as what we saw this past summer, at least for another 5 to 7 years. And El Nino is actually changing itself because of climate change. And so how climate change is affecting El Nino is another topic. But there are many ways that we can mitigate wildfire and the health effects. The problem is, can they happen at a scale big enough? But there certainly are tremendous efforts among the wildfire community to conduct prescribed burning, to promote policies for, ecologically sound thinning and fuel maintenance and things like this. But it's also true that at the scale of what happened, it's hard to match our efforts to Mother Nature in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it all. Something I wanted to mention and I forgot is that this effect of El Nino years. It's like, so during El Nino years, weather in this part of the world tends to be drier and warmer, which is like good for fires. And the global number of deaths attributed to air pollution from fires tends to double during El Nino years, which is pretty striking. The fires, 2023 fires in Canada started like in around May, I think, which was before El Nino was officially declared by the World Meteorological Organization. So it's not only El Nino, but of course that made it like worse. And another interesting fact that I wanted to share is that climate change is expected to worsen fires, not just by making weather warmer and drier, but also carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas, is what plants eat, basically. So it fertilizes plants and under certain circumstances allows them to grow more. So in some places, there's going to be more plant growth and more fuel accumulation. And that could actually, according to some recent studies, worsen fires even more than the weather effects, which is quite interesting. So it's a very complicated, but of course, there are ways of mitigating both the magnitude of fires and also the health consequences, of which you can probably tell more.
Yeah. Thanks. This is a great question. So I think what we talk about here is the extreme event. But what we don't talk about, and we're still doing a lot of research on, is the Wi-Fi smoke that are not that severe, that do not make the Atlantic skies orange. They are still dangerous. And we are doing research showing at less than 10 microgram per cubic meter level, that's the majority of the Wi-Fi smoke in the US people are exposed to. And contrary to what people think, oh, this may be historically just the Western US thing. No, you have that as well in the East Coast, not just northeast, but in the southeast as well. So what I want to mention is that when we talk about the air pollution health burden that Sebastian has been showing, that is only the total burden. And that total burden is from epidemiological research that did not consider Wi-Fi related smoke. So there has been some new studies trying to estimate the global smoke-related PM2.5. And more research like what we are doing in the US nationwide is trying to provide more and more research on the smoke-related PM2.5. That may have some difference than the total PM2.5 mass. And once that's done, there will be likely addition impacts from that. And we actually already seen that trend in the US over the past 5 years. The US air quality, the PM2.5 overall level is not decreasing, despite the fact we have the Clean Air Act. It's very successful. But because the fire source, the PM2.5, the overall PM2.5 is not decreasing, but relatively speaking, is increased a little bit. So on the long run, I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more fire source related to PM2.5, although it may not be extremely high as the Canadian Wi-Fi, but we still will expose to some of them. So now in terms of what we can do. So I think Jen mentioned the prescribed fire. There has been ongoing research trying to show what's the difference of air pollution level during a prescribed fire versus extreme wildfire. And there has been some early evidence showing that if you are using what we call purple air monitor in your house during this prescribed fire, that are extremely lower than if you would otherwise have a Wi-Fi event. So that may be one thing. Of course, this more complex in terms of forest management. In terms of personal things, I think definitely one thing the reason why we want to do this is try to make people realize Wi-Fi events, extreme Wi-Fi events, is also a public health crisis. It's like what we are receiving for tomorrow's winter storm alert, right? So when you receive that, you will take precautions, right? We may stay working from home, but how many of you know the news that, okay, the orange turns orange? What do? Like take a picture, tell friends, okay, carry on, right? Because not many of us actually realize the health impacts. So I think the first immediate step is to realize that the Wi-Fi smoke is really a public health problem as well, especially for people with asthma that may be triggering their events. And then we can talk about individual measures, using air purifiers, using HEPA filters, wearing N95 masks. So these are the personal protection gears. Yeah, thank you.
Add one last thing about the question about the ceiling of the population, who's making these connections. One population that I've sort of been fascinated with are evangelical Christians, because they have such a defined sense of looking towards the future and anticipating what's coming, right, in a way that my informants are not. But for a lot of folks who see God's plan as involving catastrophes and cataclysms, the idea of major fires, major wars, droughts, etc., signal the end of the world and the return of Jesus Christ. And so will be interpreted as catastrophes and problems, but also as a divine return. Right. And so I think there will always be a percentage, specifically in the United States, for whom this is all subsumed as part of a larger supernatural process and less connected to individual activities. Not saying that they won't necessarily make the link between the activities, but I think where many of us would sort of stop in terms of, ontologies and what's happening next. I think a lot of people are taking the next steps from the Bible, essentially, and saying, well, the end times are near, essentially, and Christ is coming back.
I can add one more thought to that, which is that demographics do play a role in this as well, because younger people are much more likely to say this is a real problem, a serious problem. It's happening now. They're worried about it. They support policy more. And the group who is most likely to be dismissive is our older white conservative men. So it's actually called the conservative white male effect. So there's a name for it. They actually perceive a whole host of risks as less threatening and risky than the rest of the population. We used to think it was that women were more anxious and perceived higher risk than men. And in some cases, there's some truth to that, but it's actually more, no, it's older white men versus everyone else. That's where the real sort of divide happens. So at least if we let this play out over a decade or more, that number will continue going up.
Well, that is actually us at time. So will you please join me in thanking our panelists today for Thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of the week. And stay tuned for future Canadian Studies events.